Disclaimer: the content presented in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. I, Zayd Haji, author and research student, provide analysis based on publicly available data, research reports, and credible financial sources, including the International Monetary Fund, IMF, World Bank, United Nations (UN), and other recognized institutions. The insights shared reflect my interpretations and understanding at the time of recording. They are not financial, investment, or legal advice, and listeners should not rely on this podcast as the sole basis for any financial or investment decisions. Individual circumstances vary, and professional consultation is recommended before taking any action. While all efforts have been made to ensure accuracy, I do not guarantee the completeness or timeliness of the information. References to data, statistics, or projections are cited from publicly available sources and may be subject to updates or revisions. By listening to this podcast, you acknowledge that neither I nor any affiliated parties are responsible for any actions, outcomes, or losses that may arise from applying the information discussed. Before we dive deeper, ask yourself this: are you seeing the world as it truly is, or as it has been presented to you? What you think is stable may be quietly shifting, and what we uncover together today could change the way you view every choice you make. Let us step into the quiet, almost hypnotic calm of today's global financial markets. At first glance, everything seems orderly. Stock indices hover at familiar levels, central banks maintain their rhetoric of stability, and investors whisper about risk. But in reality, beneath this calm lies a shifting ground that could destabilize the very structure of global finance. The International Monetary Fund, through its Global Financial Stability Report of October 2025, signals a clear warning. The apparent stability is fragile, underpinned by stretched valuations, soaring debt, and the rising influence of non-bank financial institutions. This is not just abstract finance. It directly affects everything from the cost of your mortgage to the price of imported goods. Take, for instance, the United States Treasury bond market, often considered the bedrock of global finance. Governments around the world, particularly advanced economies, have been expanding their fiscal deficits. This means more bonds are issued to fund government spending, and increasingly, the buyers of these bonds are price-sensitive investors. Think mutual funds or exchange-traded funds that react quickly to interest rate changes. A sudden 100 basis point increase in interest rates, combined with mass withdrawals from these funds, could trigger forced liquidations of nearly $300 billion in treasury assets. In simpler terms, if too many investors decide to sell at once, the market could temporarily freeze, prices could plummet, and borrowing costs could spike. This is not just numbers on a page. For everyday people, it could mean higher mortgage rates, rising credit card interest, or even volatility in retirement savings. The safety of our financial system is not guaranteed, it is constantly being tested. Now, consider the US dollar, the world's primary reserve currency. Its depreciation by 10% this year, despite seemingly favorable interest rate differentials, signals a disconnect. For businesses and individuals trading or saving in dollars outside the United States, this could mean higher costs when buying import goods or paying off dollar-denominated loans. The ripple effect is immediate. A weaker dollar can increase global funding costs, constrain liquidity, and tighten financial conditions everywhere. Picture this: a company in India relying on dollar-denominated imports may see costs spike, which could eventually trickle down to the price you pay for electronics, medicine, or even daily essentials. The banking sector, long considered a fortress, is also facing hidden stress. The growth of non-bank financial institutions, asset managers, hedge funds, and private credit providers has amplified risks. These institutions are now deeply interconnected with banks, creating a situation where liquidity stress in one sector can transform into solvency stress in another. A hypothetical scenario from the IMF shows that under extreme conditions, weak banks could increase from 18% of total global bank assets to 21% once non-bank exposures are considered. In layman's terms, this is like having a chain of water pipes where a blockage in one section suddenly causes leaks throughout the entire network. For you, this could translate to banks tightening loans, raising interest rates, or being cautious in offering new credit, affecting home buyers, small business owners, and even everyday savings accounts. Pause for a moment. Does it safe to assume your future is protected just because the numbers look calm? Every statistic we unpack today has real consequences for you, for your family, and for the life you are building. Emerging markets present a striking contrast. Some countries have built resilience by shifting their government debt to local investors, reducing vulnerability to foreign capital flight. These economies act like a shock absorber, smoothing out volatility when global markets stumble. Others, heavily indebted with real interest rates exceeding their growth rates, face chronic risks. For example, if a weaker emerging market experiences a 40% haircut on government bonds, half of its banking sector could dip below critical capital thresholds. This is more than theory. It is a scenario that could disrupt credit availability for businesses and consumers alike, potentially slowing economic growth and increasing unemployment in these regions. Currency markets themselves are fragile. The sheer complexity and leverage in foreign exchange trading make sudden spikes in volatility likely during times of uncertainty. Even minor shifts in investor sentiment can cause rapid adjustments in prices, influencing imports, exports, and domestic inflation. Then there are stablecoins, digital currencies pegged to the US dollar. While innovative, their rapid expansion poses risks similar to traditional money market funds. A rush of redemptions could force these issuers to sell vast quantities of government bonds, adding stress to the already delicate sovereign debt market. For ordinary people, this could affect financial products, savings options, and even the reliability of digital payments in the future. So why should this matter to you? Because these structural shifts are not confined to the boardrooms of New York or London. They influence the interest you pay on your loans, the stability of your retirement funds, the cost of goods imported from abroad, and the availability of credit for small businesses, the backbone of our everyday economy. Understanding these dynamics equips us to make smarter financial choices, from diversifying savings to being cautious with debt, and it fosters a more informed conversation about fiscal responsibility and monetary policy. The takeaway is clear: calm markets are not synonymous with safety. The intertwining of high government debt, the volatility of the US dollar, the explosive growth of non-bank financial institutions, and the rise of digital assets are reshaping the rules. Policymakers must act decisively, strengthening capital buffers, enhancing transparency, regulating new financial instruments, and ensuring liquidity support for key markets. As individuals, awareness empowers us. By understanding these forces, we can anticipate how global trends ripple down to our daily lives, protect our financial well-being, and advocate for policies that safeguard economic stability. Here's a question that most ignore. If the system that supports your daily life falters, who do you think bears the cost? As we explore this, notice how each ripple reaches closer than you realize. The world of finance is alive, shifting beneath our feet. Recognizing the vulnerabilities hidden beneath the calm is not just academic. It is essential for navigating the economic realities of today and tomorrow. By internalizing these insights, we gain the tools to make informed choices, reduce exposure to systemic shocks, and actively participate in shaping a financial environment that serves not just investors, but every one of us in our everyday lives. The 102 trillion US dollar question: who is paying the price for the world's debt? We live in a time when the most dangerous crisis humanity faces does not roar like a storm or erupt like a plague. It moves quietly through spreadsheets, bond markets, and interest rates, and yet it is stealing our futures every single day. The global public debt has reached 102 trillion United States dollars. Behind that mountain of figures lie children without schools, patients without hospitals, and young people whose dreams are quietly mortgaged to decisions they never made. Debt at its core is meant to be a promise. It is a tool that allows nations to borrow today to build tomorrow's schools, roads, hospitals, and technology. When used well, debt helps societies expand opportunity and prosperity. But that promise has become distorted. What was once a ladder for progress has turned into a trapdoor for millions. In 2024 alone, the world added another 5 trillion United States dollars to its collective debt. That is more than the total value of India's entire economy. While the world debates growth prospects and stock market rallies, this debt silently reshapes our future, setting limits on how governments care for their citizens. At first glance, it may seem that rich nations hold most of the burden. And indeed they do. 69% of global debt rests with them. The United States, for instance, is projected to hold about 35,251 billion United States dollars in financial year 2025. Japan's debt stands close to 9,528 billion. Such figures sound astronomical, yet these nations borrow cheaply. Their credit is trusted, their repayment predictable, and their access to capital almost limitless. Now let us turn to the developing world. 31% of the world's debt, around 31 trillion United States dollars, is owed by countries that are home to the majority of humanity. These are nations where every borrowed dollar must fight for survival against poverty, inflation, and fragile institutions. Their public debt is growing twice as fast as that of developed nations. Imagine two runners, one well-fed, racing on a smooth track, the other barefoot, carrying weights uphill. That is the reality of global credit. In Asia and Oceania, the debt stands at around $16,559 billion. China and India each carry about $3,177 billion. Latin America and the Caribbean together owe another $3,177 billion. Africa, with its modest economic base, owes roughly $1,895 billion, less than 2% of global debt, yet faces the harshest repayment conditions. For millions across Africa, this translates into stark choices between paying interest and providing food, between meeting creditor deadlines and saving lives. The agonizing interest tax. The problem is not only how much is owed, it is how much it costs to owe it. In 2024, developing countries paid $921 billion in interest payments alone. That is money drained from budgets meant to build hospitals, classrooms, and clean water systems. Picture it this way. If you earn $100 and 8 must go immediately to the bank before you can buy essentials, your freedom shrinks. For many nations, this is not a metaphor, it is their daily economic reality. The median developing country now spends 8% of its total government revenue merely servicing interest. A decade ago, it was half that. For 61 developing nations, it exceeds 10%. 10 out of every 100 tax dollars never touch their own soil, they vanish into creditors' accounts abroad. This is not fiscal discipline, it is fiscal despair. When national leaders face the choice between paying interest or paying teachers, many are forced to pick the former, not because they want to, but because not doing so would trigger defaults, sanctions, and soaring borrowing costs. The moral catastrophe. 3.4 billion lives here lies the moral wound of our age. Across the developing world, about 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more on interest payments than on health or education. That number, nearly half the global developing population, is not just accounting language. It represents lives put on hold. Let us take a region-wide look. In Africa between 2021 and 2023, per person spending stood at $70 on interest payments, 63 on education, and 44 on health. For every dollar invested in children's health, $1.59 went to pay creditors. That $26 gap per person means schools without teachers, clinics without medicine, and societies running on hope rather than resources. What we call debt servicing is, in human terms, the quiet auctioning of future potential. If this were the whole story, it would already be tragic. But it gets worse. Developing nations as a group now send more money out to pay old debts than they receive in new loans or investments. In 2023, this negative net resource transfer reached $25 billion. So the very countries battling poverty and scarcity are effectively lending to the rest of the world through repayments. Private creditors, mainly commercial banks and bondholders, now hold 60% of developing countries' external debts. Their loans come with high interest rates and little mercy when crises strike. While multilateral institutions discuss debt relief, many private lenders simply watch interest accumulate, protected by legal contracts that prioritize profits over people. This creates a vicious feedback loop. Nations borrow to develop, but servicing the debt drains the funds meant for development. As a result, they borrow again at higher costs. Growth slows, inequality deepens, and hope dims. Why this matters to us? Now some may ask, what does this have to do with me? The answer is everything. When governments spend more on debt than on essential services, you and I pay through lowered quality of life, fewer jobs, and higher costs of living. The price of medicines, the availability of teachers, the stability of food supply, all of these are linked to how much a country pays in debt interest. For a young person entering the workforce, rising public debt means fewer opportunities because governments have less money to invest in skills, innovation, and employment programs. For a parent, it means more out-of-pocket expenses for education and healthcare. For entire societies, it fuels a sense of frustration, a feeling that the game is rigged, that no matter how hard people work, progress remains elusive. Debt at its best should serve people. It should be the foundation for shared growth. But when debt becomes an end in itself, when the repayment of yesterday's promises steals tomorrow's potential, it ceases to be economics, it becomes injustice. At the United Nations General Assembly in 2024, 60 countries stood together demanding reform. They outlined 4 urgent actions. Inclusive global governance. Give developing nations equal representation in decision-making about global finance. Crisis time liquidity. Expand emergency resources such as special drawing rights and suspend rigid charges imposed by international institutions. Fair debt resolution. Create automatic systems that pause repayments during economic shocks or disasters. Concessional finance. Offer patient, low-cost capital for development projects, supported by stronger multilateral banks and technical expertise. Each of these steps acknowledges a simple truth: economics cannot be morally neutral. A financial system that values repayment over human dignity cannot sustain itself forever. Understanding these figures is not about mastering economics, it is about understanding the architecture of our world. A debt number written in a report can decide whether a child receives an education or not. It can determine whether a hospital has power during an emergency. And it can dictate whether a young adult somewhere in Africa, Asia, or Latin America gets to dream beyond survival. We often imagine that global finance is something distant, spoken in boardrooms and central banks. But in truth, its consequences live among us in school fee receipts, hospital queues, and food prices. Every one of us is part of this system. And that means every one of us has the right and responsibility to ask, why should we live in a world where lenders are safer than children and balance sheets weigh more than human lives? The $102 trillion question is not who owes the money, it is who pays the price. And the answer, as painful as it is clear, is us. Imagine the invisible forces shaping your finances, your opportunities, your future. Can you afford to stay unaware? Stay with us, because understanding these hidden truths could shift everything you thought was certain. The 2025 debt reality. What the numbers reveal about our world when we talk of public debt today, we are not discussing an abstract economic concept buried in government reports. We are describing a living condition, something that influences the price of food, the availability of jobs, the quality of hospitals, and even the dreams young people dare to chase. In financial year 2025, the world's governments collectively owe 102 trillion United States dollars. That number is so vast that it feels almost unreal until we realize what it stands for. Resources borrowed from the future to fund the present. Let us take a closer look at who carries this weight. The United States alone leads with about $35,251 billion in public debt. Next comes China, whose debt stands near 16,559 billion, followed by Japan with 9,528 billion. Behind them are major European economies, the United Kingdom with roughly 3,689 billion, France with 3,576 billion, and Italy with around 3,209 billion. Germany, one of the world's most disciplined fiscal performers, sits at 2,976 billion, while Canada holds about 2,482 billion. Then we move beyond the dominant powers to emerging and developing economies, where the story begins to change tone. India's debt is close to 3,177 billion. Brazil's around 1,895 billion, Spain's 1,753 billion, Mexico's 1,082 billion, and Egypt's about 348 billion. The figures shrink in size, but the burden on these countries is often heavier in human terms. At first glance, it seems logical to assume that the biggest debts belong to the richest countries and that those nations are the most vulnerable. But that is not how the world works. Developed countries like the United States, Japan, and those in Europe hold around 69% of the total global debt, yet they borrow money cheaply. Their governments are viewed by investors as safe borrowers, so their interest rates remain low. Think of it like a credit card system. The richest nations get rewarded with low-interest cards, no matter how much they spend. On the other hand, developing countries, home to billions of people, collectively owe around $31 trillion, or 31% of the global stock of debt. They face double the borrowing growth rate of rich countries and pay far higher interest for every borrowed dollar. It is like being charged extra for being poor. Their economies are smaller, their currencies weaker, and their repayment capacity more fragile. When storms strike, be it a pandemic, a natural disaster, or a global price shock, these nations have fewer safety nets and less room to borrow. This means their loans often come with painful trade-offs: less money for schools, smaller hospital budgets, and fewer public projects that create jobs. The invisible pressure of debt becomes visible in daily struggles: the broken classroom ceiling, the overworked nurse, the rising bus fare. As we near the end, I want you to carry this thought: knowledge is not comfort, it is survival. The more you see beneath the surface, the more power you have to act. Ask yourself, are you ready to face what most people refuse to see? When debt chokes development, numbers can feel detached, but debt shapes everyday life in more ways than most of us realize. Imagine you are running a household, but before buying food or paying school fees, you must first hand over 8 out of every $100 you earn to a bank just to stay out of default. That is the reality of many developing countries today. between 2014 and 2024, their interest payments doubled from about 4% to 8% of government revenue. In 61 countries, this figure exceeds 10%. These funds are not building anything new. They are simply servicing what already exists. Take Egypt or Brazil, for instance. Their total public debts are smaller than those of the United States or Japan, but their ability to carry it is far weaker. These nations often spend more on interest than on healthcare or education combined. As citizens, we might not see it directly on our bills, but it lives inside every underfunded school, understaffed hospital, and neglected rural road. Debt is the silent tax, the one we pay without voting for it. Why should we care about these faraway debts? Because they dictate the quality of life for billions and eventually for all of us. When developing economies are crushed by debt, global trade slows down. When jobs vanish abroad, migration pressures rise. When public services shrink, instability grows. Every economy today is connected. A shock in one part of the world ripples through all the rest. For instance, when India or Brazil devotes billions to interest instead of infrastructure, it means fewer markets for global trade, fewer employment opportunities for their youth, and slower overall growth for the planet. When African nations spend more on debt than on healthcare, diseases spread faster and humanity as a whole suffers. This is not only about economics, it is about empathy and shared destiny. Debt is meant to help societies move forward. But when borrowed promises become burdens, we all stand still together. The $102 trillion owed globally is more than a number. It is a mirror reflecting what we choose to value: financial balance sheets or human potential. To solve this imbalance, we need more than economic reforms, we need moral clarity. High debt nations must continue economic discipline, but lenders and institutions must also reform their approach. They must offer patient capital instead of profit-driven lending, design fair debt resolution systems that suspend payments in crises, and give developing nations greater say in global financial governance. The goal is simple. No country should have to choose between paying creditors and caring for its people. This awareness matters to every citizen. As young people, as professionals, and as voters, understanding how debt works equips us to question policies that trade our tomorrow for political comfort today. It reminds us that true progress is not measured by how much a nation borrows, but by what it builds with what it borrows. The global debt story may seem distant, but its consequences live among us in the cost of living, in the quality of education, and in the promise of our futures. When we ask who pays the price of the world's debt, we must have the courage to answer honestly. We all do. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the world of global finance and the hidden costs of debt. I hope this episode has given you a clearer understanding of how decisions made in far-off financial capitals ripple through everyday lives, from the prices we pay for goods to the opportunities available for the next generation. Remember, knowledge is power. By staying informed, we can make smarter financial choices, engage in meaningful conversations, and advocate for a system that prioritizes people over profits. I am Zayd Haji, your guide to the complex world of economic research and insights. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe, share, and join the conversation, because understanding these forces is not just about economics. It is about shaping a better future for all of us. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, the more we understand, the better we can act.